some of the people that I'm thinking of as we're having this conversation, I know that their desire is to stay in the relationship, but the requirement then is that they engage in activities that actually are sinful.
Yeah.
So they're actually required to continue sinning against who they now know is the true Jesus Christ. Let's jump right in. So our topic today is divorce. And of course, we're talking about divorce in some different scenarios than maybe listeners have previously thought of. We're talking about divorce in the context of people who have suffered religious abuse in their homes and potentially have realized that they are maybe even in a cultic experience and are making decisions about what are their options, what can they do if they are still wanting to honor the Lord with their choices. So that's our context for this conversation. To get us started, overall, what reasons are grounds for divorce? Or as many would put it, what criteria must I meet in order to get a divorce while remaining in alignment with God's word? So people are trying to kind of be like, I'm not going rogue. I still want to honor the Lord, but what are my options here?
To err on the side of caution, the typical Protestant answer to that question since the Reformation in the 16th century, following the teaching of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, is that if all else has been tried, and it's probably important to preface these remarks by saying God's desire is always that a marriage be salvaged if there's any way possible. But both Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, I believe it's verse 32, and Matthew 19:9, have in them what has come to be called the exception clause, that says in the case of adultery, marital unfaithfulness, and by that we mean actual sexual relations, not what some people might just call an emotional affair, then it is permitted. And that's interesting language, because in ancient Judaism, it was required in the case of the one flesh uniqueness of marriage being broken. And Jesus never requires divorce in any situation, but it is there as a permission. And then the second key passage is in 1 Corinthians 7. And this one is a little more difficult because it talks about an unbeliever in the case of a mixed marriage, probably because in Paul's day, in the first generation of Christianity, people who were already married were coming to the Lord, and there was no guarantee that their husband or wife would follow them in that. And therefore, someone found themselves in that kind of a mixed marriage. And Paul says if the unbeliever wants to leave, that is also permitted. There's no guarantee that the believing partner could stop them anyway. And Paul says God is a God of peace, and does not want the endless conflict that kind of a mixed marriage could cause. But he goes on to say, if the unbeliever wants to stay in the marriage, then that remains the ideal. Now, that's the biblical text. That raises all kinds of questions for application in other times and places. Is it primarily the mixed marriage that is the issue that Paul has in mind? Is it primarily the fact that one person wants to leave without any intention of returning? So there would be people who would say it's the abandonment, which makes for some nice alliteration. Then you've got adultery and abandonment, the two A's that are the criteria. But those are the texts that one has to wrestle with and decide how they understand and how they apply them. A lot more I could say, but I probably should stop there and let you direct the conversation where you want to next.
Sure. I'm going to break it up a little bit. And I want to start with 2 Corinthians 6:14, because I believe this is being used out of context. I'm hearing people apply it in situations where it doesn't apply. So 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? Does this verse in any way apply to an already married couple? My understanding is this is before you make the decision
Right.
to become married.
I don't believe it applies, at least not in any direct way, to an already married couple. It's interesting, the Greek word that is used there can certainly be translated be, but it is even more commonly to become. It's not the main verb in Greek for to be. And so I suspect the idea is more, don't enter into a situation where you're unequally yoked. The other interesting thing about that passage is, in context, it doesn't say anything about marriage at all. It's talking about a Christian being linked with that to that which is idolatrous in the context of temple worship. And we have, over the history of the church, come to use that expression, unequally yoked, almost as a synonym for a mixed marriage. And there no doubt is some application there, but it is interesting to study it in its original context and the original meaning of the word, which had to do with a pair of oxen. You don't try to put a yoke matching an adult and an adolescent ox, for example, because it would be sloping downhill and the two wouldn't work well together. And so it's a much more general statement of being aware of overly close association that requires two individuals doing something jointly to be on the same spiritual page, as it were.
I've heard it applied not only to marriages, but also to friendships, where if someone is wanting to take a step away from a friend who they're feeling like is not maybe a good influence, is not heading in a good direction, heading in the same direction they want to go. And so I've heard it used in that way, like, well, I'm unequally yoked with this best friend. I want to distance myself from this relationship. This isn't healthy. It's sounding like you would agree there is some application to that, correct?
There could be, if the nature of that friendship is what every parent of teenagers dreads, I suppose, where the person wanting to distance themselves for whatever reason, is not the person who can have who can hold his or her own with the other one, who could be actually a positive influence on them. And it's just a case of the more they hang out, the more the one person is led into things that are not good for them. I would want to be wary of throwing that out casually in any kind of a sweeping way, because then it can and has been used too easily to say, well, believers should have all their close friends be other Christians, in which case we never get to know non-Christians well enough to share our faith in a meaningful way with them or have a positive impact on them. But yeah, there would certainly be times when that would make sense.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because I've heard it as, the way I would put it, I've heard as an excuse, as kind of a cop out to not have
Right.
to maybe do something that's hard, something that's challenging.
Yeah.
And that's not what this is about.
Right.
Looking at 1 Corinthians 7:12 through 16, I'm going to read this for everyone. To the rest, I say this: if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And so this is what you were speaking to earlier. Something else just jumped out at me as I was reading this. And if you don't mind, I'd like to spend a little time on the word sanctified and what is being said here about how one may sanctify the other in this world of religious abuse that can be used as in one direction more so than the other, of, okay, the husband is the head, and so he is now representation of the wife before God. And this can be used as kind of ammunition for that argument. And again, this isn't the understanding I have of this text. So would you mind speaking to that word sanctified and what it's meaning here?
Yes, it's important to know that throughout the Bible, the root meaning of both the Hebrew and the Greek words that are most commonly used for sanctify or to make holy or make righteous basically mean to set apart. And that can be all kinds of different setting apart. In the temple, in ancient Israel, you sanctified the altar and the vessels that were put upon the altar. And that does not mean that somehow they were spiritually saved. I don't think anybody wants to start developing a theology of saving cups and basins and spoons and such things, but setting something apart for some kind of holy purpose. Paul does very frequently use the word sanctify in the stronger and more spiritual sense of what happens when a person is saved. They are treated as holy from that moment onward, but they also have a responsibility to grow in holiness. But that's not how the term is being used here. It's simply that broader meaning of, if there is a Christian parent in a family, you read reference to children, there is always the potential for that Christian parent to, because the Spirit is in them, have a positive, good effect on their spouse and on their children, which, if the marriage is dissolved, then certainly that positive effect is no longer there for the spouse. It may or may not be, depending on who gets the children. But as you continue to read, it ended up by saying, we can't make this an absolute. If the unbeliever wants to leave, you may not be able to stop them. God wants to create peace. And, oh, by the way, how do you know that you would be able, with God's help, to save them, to lead them to the Lord? I have known marriages where that has happened, where particularly where an individual has just been a wonderfully positive, faithful witness over a long period of time to an unsaved partner. But more often than not, it seems that's not what happens. And so Paul is saying, yeah, that's the ideal, but you can't count on it. If one person wants to leave because they don't want anything to do with this Christian commitment, then we probably need to let them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there are any nuances that we've missed in what you just shared when we put this in the context of a religious abuse situation? And to clarify for anyone listening, when I'm saying religious abuse, I'm not talking about the belief system where then there's physical abuse going on. I think then we've stepped in a different direction. I'm talking strictly about Christian doctrine, talking about the Bible, things being taken out of context and used in a way that is harmful. And within that, the children are being raised in that environment as well. So you're having to go to church on Wednesday and Sunday, and you're having to take the kids. And it's in this environment where you now know this isn't actually Christianity. And this is unhealthy. And it's from a religious standpoint, from a worldview standpoint, this is damaging. And I have significant concerns as I'm taking all this in. How am I renewing my mind? And now my children are being raised in this environment. And again, that could be the male or the female struggling with this. Do you think anything shifts? Is there anything else that we'd want to add to our thinking here?
It might be good for you to read at this point, since I believe you were going to do it coming up anyway, the verses that introduced 1 Corinthians 7:12-16, which would be verses 10 to 11. So we get the whole package, and then I think I can better address that question.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let me pull it up real quick. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife.
So that's where the conversation on the topic of divorce actually begins in 1 Corinthians 7. And then you move into the special case of the unbeliever who wants to leave. The first thing that's probably important to say there is that while there are two Greek words being used, separate and divorce, as far as we can tell, they are simply synonyms. It's not the idea of a temporary separation like we sometimes talk about. I say that because for any kind of abuse, and that word today is used very broadly. When I was growing up and when I was a young adult and people had conversations around this topic, and someone would say, well, what should I do if I'm in an abusive marriage? It was almost universally understood you were talking about people who are experiencing physical harm. Today, everything has shifted, and not only do we hear of emotional abuse and verbal abuse, but in our society that is rightly sensitive to these kinds of things, I have heard people use the word abuse in a context of a person of the opposite sex or same sex in a homosexual context, touching me, a gentle touch in the wrong way, is suddenly called abuse. I would dearly love to be able to turn to a chapter and verse that said, if your husband hit you on the arm more than 3 times, you can divorce him. That would make things so simple. Yeah. And it would play exactly to the legalism that we all like to find because we don't like to think for ourselves. And it's scary to have to be responsible for ourselves. Let me back up and make the comment that I think there are additional circumstances besides physical adultery and an unbelieving partner wishing to permanently leave that probably are, in today's world, grounds for legitimate divorce. But here's how I get there. Jesus only gives one exception to his command to stay married. How does Paul get away with coming along and adding another? Unless he realized that Jesus was not giving a universal list for all times and all circumstances of a list of one. And how is it that Jesus could get by without saying anything about what Paul, under the inspiration of the Spirit, would say later, unless he too knew that he was addressing a very situation-specific question? And we can discern that from Matthew 19, because Pharisees came together to try to trap Jesus, beginning of the chapter. They're not out asking for advice for themselves or their friends who may be in a difficult marriage. They're just trying to find some reason to be able to arrest and convict our Lord Jesus Christ. And so in that context, there were 2 groups of Pharisees, those who followed a rabbi by the name of Hillel and those who followed a rabbi by the name of Shammai. And Shammai was the more conservative and said divorce is only possible under the case of adultery. And oh, by the way, it's required then. And Hillel agreed with that, but said, no, there are other serious situations as well. That's the context that Jesus is being asked to speak into. But there are no unbelieving partners wanting to leave, because Jesus is in an entirely exclusively Jewish context. Paul is addressing a brand new situation that has come about because the gospel now is going out to the Gentile world. Once we understand that, then we have to say or ask what else may be as permanently damaging beyond repair to a marriage as breaking the one flesh, unique allegiance created in sexual consummation, or the physical, geographical separation by someone who wants nothing further to do with another individual. It's fascinating that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, when God sets up the very first marriage between Adam and Eve, he says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. The leaving and cleaving creates the tightest bond of interpersonal allegiance at the human level. It's transferred from parents to spouse. The one flesh is bigger than, but it includes the sexual consummation. What both Jesus and Paul in essence have done is to say, if one of those two very constituent elements of marriage is broken, then in essence, divorce is simply acknowledging, solemnizing, finalizing what has already happened.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other such situations? Sadly, in a fallen world, I think the answer is yes. Do many people believe they have reached that point before they have? Sadly, I believe that is also true. And when people come to me, and I have had a number of times in my life, people I have known well, whose marriage is really struggling, and basically they have come to me wanting my permission, as if I were God, and wanting a biblical scholar whose views they trust to put his imprimatur on what they want to do. And I've had to say a number of times, that's not my role. This is a decision you have to make before God. I can lay out the evidence, which is why I've taken so long. And if I'm going too long, just stop me at any point. This is how I understand the text. There are two instances, and one of them, we're not sure, is it the abandonment or the mixed marriage that is the crucial part. But I think what God is saying is preserving the marriage should always be the priority. It should be the priority when you think you've tried everything, try something more. Involve genuine, mature Christians, if at all possible. Don't make any hasty decisions. If we had the time, I could tell you of people who begged me for my stamp of approval on their divorce, who I said, I understand why you want one. If that's the choice you make before God, I will support you. But it's not my role to say, I give you permission. And in a couple of cases, I never heard from those people for several years. And then they came back and said, I'm so glad you never gave me permission, because I tried a little bit more and it's a miracle, but let me tell you how well we're doing. Hallelujah. And in other cases, same scenario. they went off and divorced, and in at least one instance I can think of, are now very happily remarried. That all you and I can do when people ask us for advice is to lay out the situation, why the Bible gives these scenarios. So now you're wondering, am I ever going to come back to your original question? Are there other nuances in the case of somebody who is in a cult? Yeah, there have to be. There have to be other nuances. If for whatever reason there are no ways to avoid spiritual damage continuing, especially for kids. Now, here's one more nuance. What we call a separation, a legal separation, perhaps, often, sadly, is just an intermediate step before a formal divorce, but not always. And again, I have known, in this case, it's been women, it can happen the other way as well, who by getting themselves out of harm's way, maybe even accompanied by a restraining order, but without yet initiating divorce, have in fact so shocked their husbands into realizing how serious this is, that getting the help they needed, which in your example would mean coming out of the cult, actually was what finally took place. But again, there are no guarantees, and that's probably more the exceptional circumstance. But even before divorce, I would say, have you tried just separation? So incredibly long-winded answer. I will not do this ever again on your show. To say, yes, I think we have to nuance it. But I worry about the way some people get to absolutely the same conclusion that I have. But they get there by saying, oh, well, yeah, so there are surely there are other cases like physical abuse and, probably even prolonged emotional abuse and verbal abuse and alcoholism and pornography and somebody in a long jail sentence and irreversible dementia and chronic depression, and all of a sudden I want to sympathize and empathize with every one of those situations, but all of a sudden I could have a laundry list of reasons for divorce that would start encouraging more than half the currently married couples in the world to think about it and miss the whole point of Jesus and Paul and God himself, which is make a commitment to someone very thoughtfully, very carefully, very seriously, and then do everything with his help possible to stay in the relationship.
I have a few answers. So, gosh, I'm feeling the hearts of people that I've spoken with as I'm listening to your answer. And I'm also recognizing in American culture, a lot of what you've said is true. We see it. We see the sticking it out and doing the hard work and the persevering as just, we don't want to, and we want to get out. And so we minimize the covenant that we made with our spouse. And that, I think, is what you're really cautioning against.
Right.
We do not want to do that. This is a big deal. It's to be treated as such. And I would say it's our last resort after we've really tried everything else. And there have been times where separation has given that physical, emotional, psychological safety. And you're right, progress has been able to be made with support professionals and other kinds of supports. And so there might be an opportunity for reconciliation. Now, some of the people that I'm thinking of as we're having this conversation, I know that their desire is to stay in the relationship, and yet, because they love their significant other, it's not that they are not wanting it to
Right.
work, but the requirement then is that they engage in activities that actually are sinful.
Yeah.
So they're actually required to continue sinning against who they now know is the true Jesus Christ in order for them to stay in the household. And so they're in this position of, I stay with my spouse, I maintain that covenant, but this is blasphemy and I have to be a part of it, or I have to leave. And it's a heartbreaking position to
Right.
be in. And then, of course, we bring children into it more often than not. And I had wanted to mention like Proverbs 22:6. I know that can weigh very heavily on parents of train up a child in the way he should
Right.
go. And when he's old, he will not depart from it. And they think, I'm training my child up in something that is wolves in sheep's clothing. How can I do that as a loving parent with
No.
integrity
No.
and look at my God someday and be accountable for that? What do I do with that?
And I mean, you have put that so well. I hope you create a recording just of that last response and play it all over the internet just as a word of wisdom. I couldn't have said it any better. I think the only possible caveat is to say, and we'd have to talk about specifics of a particular situation. Let me just make something up that maybe by using an extreme example, it can drive home the point. A spouse tells their partner, we're going to pray to Satan before every meal. Well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that if everything else in the marriage is going well. And this is the first time this has hit me out of the blue. I'm not going to teach my children the tenets of Satanism if my partner says to do that. Well, if you're going to stay in this marriage, you've got to do it. No, I'm not going to do it. What happens then if I am told that in order to stay in a marriage, I have to do something that is against God? I'm not the one that's leaving. The other person is saying you can't stay. That's something quite different. And so I think there are ways to think about this that are consistent with everything you said. But it's not the Christian who is victimized who is the real initiator of the divorce. Maybe they treat that just like physical abuse, and it's no, I need to get out of spiritual harm's way, and I need to get the kids out of spiritual harm's way. And I think of a man who was incarcerated for a couple of years, I think falsely, whose wife went berserk. He will admit to some physical roughness, but nothing that left a mark, as people like to say. nothing that he did not apologize for profusely and demonstrate change. And his wife left and absolutely refused to get a divorce for several years, supposedly on the grounds that she wanted to honor God and not be the one getting the divorce. Well, that was a case of it just being a sham. And finally, she met somebody else. And so in order to go with this other person, she filed for divorce. That's not the same situation you're describing, but my point is you can separate, you can be protected, you can be surrounded with good people who are starting to help you put your life back together without being the one who necessarily formally initiates divorce. Maybe it will come to that someday, but maybe it will shock the other person into something marvelous. Maybe it won't, but eventually they will realize that they really are the biggest problem here. And if they don't want this marriage, they need to take the initiative. All this is so countercultural. All this is so against our modern Western mindset, which is we want immediate gratification. Don't tell me about not spending more than I have. That's what credit cards are for. Don't talk to me about 18% interest on credit card debt. I'll worry about that in the future. Don't talk to me about consequences for X, Y, and Z. And you and I are part of that same culture, and I'm guilty of succumbing to it every day. And the question you haven't even asked me yet is, so what if I screwed up and didn't do it right in the past, but the past is past and now I'm in a new relationship and whatever? And the answer is make the best of it. Do it the very best you can the next time around. What if I divorced wrongly and remarried? Was that legit? Was it not? Don't obsess over that. Deuteronomy 24 says you're not to end a second marriage in order to go back and reclaim a first. That is absolutely fascinating. Because if, as some people say that marriage is really irrevocable in God's eyes, that, you're in permanent adultery if you go off with somebody else, then Deuteronomy 24 makes no sense whatsoever. Then God's will would be, well, of course, put away your new spouse to go back to the original one, if there's ever a chance of that happening. And that's exactly what Moses says in the name of the Lord, you are never to do. So wherever people are who are listening here and distressed about stuff that has happened in the past, we can't undo the past. We're called to just be as God honoring and loving. And if we're in a new marriage, make that the most wonderful, beautiful model ever, and move ahead, look forward, don't look back.
And for someone who's maybe in that middle space where they've ended the first marriage, they're wondering if they can get married a second time. I know a couple of women who are now 70s and 80s who never remarried because they had divorced their husband. And there was something too, I want to rabbit trail for 1 second on this. People can get really nervous about this technicality of I'm the one who filed for divorce. There's something about I'm the one who actually did it. I took the action. And so that means the sole weight is on me. I'm the perpetrator in some form or another. And I really see that as a technicality personally. I don't think God's going to get hung up on who actually filed. And in one of these scenarios, the husband had started taking a second partner in a polygamous situation. And so it was going to be ongoing. She believed that to be adultery as a Christian. And so she filed for divorce, but she felt like, well, I divorced him. Really, he committed adultery and left you in essence.
Oh,
And
sure.
so can we just speak to that act of physically filing? How significant do you
Well,
think that is?
certainly in the case of where you have come to believe there is a legitimate reason for divorce, then in the ancient world, basically, where singleness as an adult was a very undesirable situation, which is quite different from what we find ourselves in today. About the only reason anybody ever divorced was in order to remarry. It was assumed you were divorcing to remarry. So if my spouse has committed adultery, if they have abandoned me, if it's a mixed marriage, if it's any one of these other situations, which I'm not going to create a list and say, well, okay, it fits number 5. But if I say this marriage is beyond retrievable, and I have some more objective friends who agree with me, if it's a legitimate divorce, then it doesn't matter who initiates it. That legitimates remarriage. The danger, and this probably, again, is not the kind of person you're thinking of, but I assume there will be some listeners who are in very different situations as well, or who could be, is the person who very cavalierly or casually or callously or something else that doesn't start with a CA. Oh yeah, I'm going to run off with her. She's younger and prettier, whatever. That we create a situation where we say, right, you're divorced, you can't go back and undo that, so you're free to do anything you want. That's where reading 1 Corinthians 7:10-11 becomes very significant. But if you're talking about people who are decades from an original marriage, the partner isn't even around, or the partner is remarried, or it doesn't matter who initiated that divorce. It's a whole new world. Now, the one proviso there that I think every professional counselor would want to make is there is never a marriage that is 100% one person's fault when it ends in divorce. It might be 80-20, it might be 90-10, but or it might be 50-50, but whatever, if I'm the newly single person, whatever I did not do ideally the first time around, I need to identify, I need to repent, and I need to get some empowering, whether through informal or formal counseling, so that I don't just repeat that scenario all over again. The statistical fact, sadly, is that second marriages, on average, last even a shorter period of time than first marriages. There are plenty of wonderful exceptions to that. I want to be one of the wonderful exceptions if I'm in that situation. And it's not going to happen if I just continue my life with nothing changing from the way I was before, except I am now away from this toxic person. So be sure that you get that kind of intervention and change that is needed.
Yes. And for some of those who are listening who feel like they're just so weighed down and stuck after getting out of an abusive relationship. And again, we're talking about religious abuse, which can lead into physical abuse and it's an umbrella statement that can have a lot of different legs to it. But I really want to point out and bring attention back to something that Dr. Blomberg, you alluded to, which is there's a difference between feeling the weight and the gravity of the situation, feeling repentant for areas of our own fault, and for living in shame and condemnation and punishment for ourselves until the day we die. Those are not the same thing, and that is not what Christ calls us to.
You say things so much more clearly and succinctly. You probably don't even need a guest to interview for this.
You gave me all of it to summarize. So you gave it to me. I just had to bring it together. This last question, for some, this is kind of like just a fun question.
Oh, good.
For me, I know the reality of it. And so some of our listeners, this is just going to be interesting. This is the polygamy question that I had sent over to you.
Oh, yeah.
And it is theologically interesting. It is interesting to think about. But there are people who really live this, and it's a genuine question that they have, and they don't know what in the heck they're supposed to do with it. So and I'm sticking with polygamy in general. It can go either way. Of course, we do have many women with many men with one female in some cultures. But here in this situation, if a male has been practicing polygamy and he realizes that he is in a cult situation where this has been commonly practiced, encouraged, maybe even required, and he decides that he's going to exit the situation, should he remain married to all of his wives?
Well, in America, it's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So that adds another dimension. In a variety of African and Asian countries, it's not illegal. I first encountered this issue years ago as a young adult in talking to or in hearing missionaries at a church I attended talk about facing this very situation in Africa. And it is fascinating because missionaries have given two very contradictory answers to that question. There are those, understandably, who say no, and it usually is a polygamous man, needs to put away all of his wives except the original one. And what the Western missionary doesn't always realize is that in some cultures, that leaves the second, third, and however many other wives there are in a position of absolute shame and rejection and little access to resources. It may be, in extreme cases, a death sentence. And so over time, I think today you would find a much larger percentage of people, of Western missionaries, saying no, in a context where it's legal, in a context where it sends different cultural signals. What we do is we train the children, the friends, the associates of the original polygamist that this is not an option for you.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that the elder statesman puts away all but an original wife. In an American context, I would think that would be quite different. I would think it would be unusual for women separated from a single, not single as an unmarried, but just one husband, not to be able to get access to help and resources, especially if they move to a town of any size, if they've been way out in the Utah wilderness or wherever. And so it's hard for me to imagine how I would counsel a polygamous family to stay together in the US. That would be what would create all the stigma and actually the breaking of the law, as opposed to what might happen in a context overseas.
Mm-hmm. And I can tell just from what you said, there's a whole other episode we could do on this. So I'm gonna let that lay where it is, because it really is a whole other episode. But I want to approach this from one other angle, because I haven't heard someone bring it up from this angle before. And I think it's really important on behalf of the female. If the family has exited as a family, so we have, say, 3 women and 1 man, and suddenly one of the females is feeling like her husband's committing adultery on the nights he's not spending with her, do you think she is able to exit that relationship?
Yeah. I mean, he is committing adultery by biblical standards.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And again, that may be confusing for some who aren't sure how to look at the Old Testament in relation to polygamy, this difference between descriptive and prescriptive, and what's going on there. And so, again, I'm going to let that be for now, but if it's a conversation you're interested in, Lynn, let me know and I'll bring you back on, or maybe you don't want to touch this one anymore.
Well, or just a very brief comment, which is similar to what we talked about a week ago. Christians have to take the entire biblical canon into account. There are hard questions about what was tolerated in terms of slavery in the Old Testament. There are hard questions in terms of what, on at least one occasion, God commanded that today would be called holy war. But the question is, that's an important question to discuss for someone who wants to respect the Bible, is what do we do with the ways things were set up in ancient times? And that can be a topic of another conversation, but that's not what guides the Christian. What guides the Christian is the understanding, after the coming of Jesus, fulfilling all of the scriptures, not just the law, but everything from Genesis to Malachi. How does the New Testament age Christian live? And at least in the case of polygamy, it's clear, if I want to honor God today, that is not an option.